At a glittering winter gala where every glass clinked with wealth and every smile was rehearsed, a billionaire CEO made a reckless promise he never intended to keep. "If you can make this room shut up with a piano, I'll marry you." The words were a dare, a joke for donors in pearls, but when the janitor he mocked sat down at the keys, the room fell silent, and Adrian Vale's carefully built life began to unravel. What happened next was not spectacle, but revelation. Would he keep his impossible vow, or lose everything it awakened? The first time Adrian Vale saw her, she was on her knees, not in prayer, but with a rag in one hand and a little bottle of lemon oil in the other, coaxing a tired shine back into the century-old black lacquer of the Whittemore's grand piano. She worked with a tenderness that made the old thing seem alive. Every motion was careful, every circle small and patient, like she was soothing a creature's fur. Guests in gowns and tuxedos swept past her as if she were part of the furniture, and to be fair, in a hotel like this, caretakers often were, present and invisible. Still, something about the way she looked at the instrument, the way her fingers hovered for a beat before touching a smudge, as if asking permission, caught Adrian's eye and tugged at a memory he hadn't visited in years, a memory of long lessons and a stern tutor in a boy's hands, told not to grip power, but to feel it hum through bone and tendon and skin. He shook it off because nostalgia was a luxury like the champagne he rarely drank. He was here to host the Foundation's winter gala, not to wonder why a grand piano in a hotel lobby made his chest feel like he'd swallowed something glowing and too big to name. The Whittemore's chandeliers were ablaze, gilding money with more money until even the walls looked expensive. Strings of soft jazz drifted from the quartet on the balcony. Waiters moved like choreography, and every second person told Adrian how generous, brilliant, visionary he was, as if those words were keys and he was the room's instrument. He had learned to nod like a man used to praise, to move like gravity preferred him. A decade ago, he'd bought a dying hotel and turned it into an icon, grown a family fund into a constellation of ventures, and taught himself to be the sort of man who would smile at a problem and say, "Of course not," when asked if it was difficult. Tonight, the donors were expecting a speech about culture and legacy and the city's future. They weren't expecting the caretaker. He wasn't either until he found her again, now standing, wiping her cloth on a folded towel, as a flock of board members approached the piano for photos. She stepped back into the shadow of a marble column. The photographers asked for a few chords, a flourish, something to break the stiffness of staged charity. The house musician had stepped away for a moment. An uncomfortable murmur gathered. "Play something, Adrian," said Cassandra, the board chair whose hair was the precise blonde of a perfect promise. "You took lessons, didn't you?" "I took everything I was told to," he said lightly, hand on the lid. He didn't want to play because playing meant remembering, and remembering meant hearing his father's voice saying, "Stop feeling it. Executed it." Performance was a kind of nakedness he'd sworn off long before he learned the more lucrative forms of undressing. The caretaker cleared her throat. It was small and careful, the sound of a person unlearning invisibility. He turned. Up close she was maybe 30, maybe younger. Her hair was pulled back without fuss, the kind of ponytail that announces a day of real work. There was a tiny crescent scar near her temple and the calm of someone who had learned to put out fires before they became disasters. "Sir," she said, "if you need music, I could—" The sentence drifted off into the high ceiling, swallowed by chandelier light. The crowd turned like a flock. Someone laughed, not cruelly, just casually cruel. Cassandra tilted her head in a way that meant, "She's adorable," and also in the way that meant, "Keep her in her place." Adrian smiled, a defense mechanism disguised as charm. "You can play?" The caretaker looked at the piano and then at him, not with deference, but with a measuring kind of quiet. "Yes." "And what do you play?" another donor asked. "Hymns?" "Anything with a heartbeat," she said. The donors laughed again, this time because they didn't understand, and people laugh when they're uncomfortable. Adrian felt something reckless tilt inside him. He was already a little sharp from the speeches he'd have to give, the money he'd have to ask for, the way power is mostly a very polite hunger. He caught his reflection in the piano lid, an elegant man in a midnight suit with a smile that was a weapon and a shield, and heard himself say louder than he meant to, "All right, if you can make this room shut up with a piano, I'll marry you." There was a little gasp, then a burst of elegant laughter and a few gleeful oohs, like school children around a dare. Cassandra's hand found his elbow with the pressure of a leash. Adrian regretted the words the second they left him, not because of the vow. People like him were always making impossible promises, but because the caretaker's face didn't flush with embarrassment or anger. It didn't flinch. It went very still, the way people get when they decide to let the truth have the floor. "What's your name?" he asked, softer than his joke deserved. "Maris," she said. "Maris Ortega." He stepped back, suddenly, less amused and more curious. "The floor is yours, Miss Ortega?" Her hand hovered over the keys for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat the room rearranged itself, all the light and expectation suddenly bending toward the bench beneath her. There was a smear of lemon oil on her knuckle, and a thin line of callus along her palm, evidence of scrubbing more than practicing. Something in him braced to be kind when she was mediocre. He was preparing a gracious speech about courage when she pressed her fingers down and unmade his life. It wasn't a piece he recognized. It wasn't a piece, not really. It was a story that started slow and precise, like rain teaching itself to be an ocean. She didn't so much play as converse with the piano, coaxing it into remembering itself. Its long summers, the flirtation of moonlight on the lid, the way a child's laugh had once become a cadenza in this very lobby 50 years ago. It should have been ridiculous to hear all that in sound, but it wasn't. The melody threaded through the room in a line so clean it felt inevitable, and then, just when people remembered to breathe, it broke itself open and poured joy everywhere. Conversation stopped. Glasses stilled midair. The quartet on the balcony lowered their instruments one by one, like soldiers recognizing a better general. A server caught a flute of champagne inches before it toppled, and didn't look away from the piano as he righted it. Adrian felt the floor tilt the way it had when he was 12, and discovered that music was the only language that didn't lie to him. He had learned other languages since leverage, margin, exit, and they had built him a city of rooms. But the one with the piano had no door. He didn't even know he'd moved until he was standing closer, the notes so near his ribs he could have sworn he could taste their metal. Maris played like a person who had taught herself to get by on crumbs and then refused to starve. She played like someone who had loved enough to learn the exact weight of a goodbye and the work of forgiving it. There was no showmanship, no flourish, just this endless devotion to the center of the thing, and it stunned him, not just because it was beautiful, but because it was familiar. Not the music, but the hunger in it. He recognized it the way people recognize a dialect they once spoke and forgot. When she finished, the sound didn't fall so much as resolve, like a bird landing in the palm of a hand. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room tore itself open with applause, not the polite patter reserved for gala entertainment, but a standing, whole-body gratitude, the kind of sound people make when they've been given back something they didn't know they lost. Maris stood quickly, as if surprised the room hadn't somehow evaporated. She took half a step back, as if expecting to be told off for touching something expensive for too long. Her eyes flicked to him, and in them he saw not triumph, but caution, like a stray animal that had found a patch of sun and wasn't sure if it was allowed to be warm. Adrian exhaled a laugh that was really a choked sound of surrender. He didn't even look for Cassandra, didn't glance at the board, didn't perform relief for anyone but himself. He just said, "I deserved that." Then, because he had said a foolish thing in a dressy room and the universe had called his bluff, He stepped onto the small riser and took the microphone. "If any of you were wondering whether I exaggerate my promises," he smiled as the room leaned in, "I don't, and I apparently propose poorly." Laughter, grateful, relieved. "Miss Ortega, I apologize for turning your talent into a spectacle. It was thoughtless, and it was—" He stopped, the words he would have used suddenly inadequate. He tried again as the honest boy under his expensive armor reached for the mic. "It was the most alive this lobby has felt since I bought this place. We invite music to our rooms, but we forgot to ask it to stay for dinner." He turned to her. Would you play for our guests after the speeches, as our featured artist?" Maris blinked. The word artist looked like a heavy thing in her hands that she wasn't sure she was allowed to lift. She nodded. Cassandra's smile was the sort of beautiful that cracked porcelain. She applauded twice and murmured, "Lovely," through the side of her mouth. The rest of the night rearranged itself around a new center. The donors smiled wider, eager to be the kind of people who witnessed the discovery of a diamond. The quartet conferred, a little flustered, and then began to accompany her with a reverence that made even their mistakes sound like modesty. Maris didn't take a bow. She disappeared between sets, slipping to the edge of the room like someone avoiding the path of a sweeping beam. He found her in the service corridor that led to the staff elevators, leaning against the wall with her eyes closed, not resting, stealing. The music had stripped her to the truth, and now she had to put the world back on before walking in it again. "Thank you," he said, quietly enough not to startle. She opened her eyes. Up close they were brown with green around the edges, the kind of color that changed according to light. "For what? You paid me with applause. It's a fair currency here." "I owe you more than that," he said. "I turned you into a dare. That wasn't fair." "You turned yourself into one," she said, a hint of a smile. "But apology accepted." He laughed, and it came out like relief. The corridor smelled like hot metal and citrus, and the undernote of bleach he'd learned means clean. He remembered to ask, "May I ask where you learned?" "My grandmother had an upright that leaned and wheezed." She smiled, not at the memory, but at the sound of it. She worked 3 jobs to keep it tuned enough so it didn't insult itself. "And after that?" "After that, life was louder," she said. "I practiced when the building slept, and when my brother was too deep in his own universe to mind. He's not built for most of this." She made a small circle to indicate the bright, chattering world of people who understood galas. "How old is he?" 12. The word softened her like a hand smoothing linen. "Matthias. He loves maps and the sound dishwashers make when they drain." "Does he?" "Autism," she said gently, like a pocketed blade that cut only what it needed to. "We don't call it suffers from because he doesn't. He just moves differently through rooms. He taught me to listen for currents most people can't hear." She tilted her head toward the ballroom. "Like that. Hear it? The second violin is holding his breath. He's afraid of missing the entry. You can hear the waiting in his hands." He listened because she told him to, and there it was. The tightness of restraint, the heartbeat of a person afraid of being late in a world that punishes lateness. He had built companies by hearing numbers. It had never occurred to him he could hear breath. "You play again in 10 minutes," he said. "What do you need?" She glanced at the ceiling the way people do when they are trying to keep walls intact. "Honestly, a glass of water and a promise you'll leave me alone after tonight." He should have nodded. He should have given her water and space and an envelope. Instead, he heard his own voice betray him. "I can't do that." "Because you promised marriage. Because the moment you played, I realized how many rooms I've built so I don't have to feel anything." He shook his head, disbelieving at himself. "And then you turned all the lights on." She looked at him like people look at thunder when they are deciding whether to run. "Mr. Vale, I clean your hallways. I'm not your revelation. You're my employee, and that means I owe you safety and respect. Starting with making a very public promise means something that isn't about me." He forced a smile to disarm what he'd armed. "Let me fix my mistake. Tonight you are the artist. Tomorrow we talk, if you want, about anything you want, or nothing if you prefer." Maris nodded, not because she was convinced, but because she recognized sincerity when it learned to speak. "Water, then." He brought it himself. When she returned to the bench, the room hushed more quickly, like news had already traveled ahead of her. She played old songs, and strangers, strands of things. People knew, and didn't know, they knew, weaving them into a sound so clean you could see your reflection in it. By the time the gala ended, he had fielded 5 business proposals, 6 thinly veiled confessions, and 3 cautions about the optics of that little scene. He answered each with an absent politeness, because the only thing that felt true was the way Maris's hands had taught the piano to remember its body. When the last guests left and the chandeliers clicked low, he watched her cover the piano again, her movements returning to the quiet efficiency of a woman who knows that magic is a thing you have to clean up after. She didn't look to see if he was watching. That dignity, the refusal to trade herself for attention, felt like the most expensive thing in the room. "Walk you home?" he asked, ridiculous as it was in a city that had a driver waiting for him and a woman with a spine that did not need escorts to stay upright. "I can take myself," she said simply. "But thank you." He nodded. 9 o'clock tomorrow in my office, or here, if that feels less like a trap." "I start at 6, she said with a little shrug. "But I have a break at 9. We can talk in the service lounge. It has chairs you can't sit properly in." He smiled because he had never been invited into the architecture of other people's exhaustion. Service lounge it is. He didn't sleep well. He kept seeing her hands, hearing the exact moment the room decided to forget it was rich and remember it was alive. When he woke, he told himself a story, that this was about patronage, about finding talent where the industry had not bothered to look, about building a scholarship and writing a check that would console his conscience. It wasn't that these things were wrong, it was that they were insufficient. He had spent years confining the whole world to spreadsheets and exit strategies, and found himself now with a door in front of him and a key he didn't know how to hold. At 9 she was there, leaning against a vending machine that had decided to blink out of order in a font that looked tired. The service lounge did indeed have chairs that punished posture, a corkboard pinned with schedules and birthday notices, and a flyer for a community clinic gave the room a heartbeat he rarely heard, the pulse of people who made his empire function and brought their entire lives with them every shift. "You kept the time," she said. "I live by clocks," he said. "I don't," she said with quiet rebellion. "I live by people." They sat. He did not bring a contract or a camera. He brought a notepad and the preposterous hope that the right questions might be a kind of gift. "Tell me what you want," he said. "Not from me, just in general." She didn't answer immediately. People like her, he realized, don't get asked that as often as people ask things like, "Can you stay late? Can you swap a shift? Can you make it shine so I can see myself?" When she finally spoke, the words arrived like they'd been waiting at the threshold for permission. "I want a piano that doesn't live in a lobby," she said. "I want lessons that don't come with pity. I want my brother to have a place where the world understands his language without trying to translate it into ours." She glanced at the floor. "And I want to stop pretending the thing I love is a hobby I'm allowed to visit after I've served everyone else's joy." He wrote nothing. He just tried to memorize the shape of that want, how it fit in the air. "And what do you fear?" "Being a story," she said. "People like you. You like to find us and then make us characters you can save. I don't want to be a plot twist that makes you feel generous." The fact that he flinched meant the arrow had found something real. He nodded. "I deserved that." "You deserve to listen," she said, but her voice softened it. "Then I'm listening." He leaned back. "Help me build something that doesn't turn you into that. Help me write a check that doesn't sing my name more loudly than it plays your music." She studied him like a teacher deciding whether a student was ready to be trusted with the real task. Finally, she said, "Tuition will help. Time will help more. My grandmother used to say that the poor have to buy the expensive things because cheap breaks, and you have to buy it again. Give me a piano that won't break. Give me time that isn't stolen from exhaustion." "Done," he said before thinking, then caught himself. "Done. But not like a magician. We put it on paper. We make it part of your employment. We make it steady." "You can't pay me to practice." "I can pay you not to scrub 3 extra floors to afford the bus to the music school," he said. "I can pay you enough to make space for what you were made to do." She almost smiled. "That sounds like charity." "It sounds like a safe," he said, "for something priceless." The word landed between them and didn't die. She nodded once. "Okay." He started that day. He called the conservatory and arranged assessments. He bought a studio upright that did not lean or wheeze and had it delivered to the apartment Maris shared with her brother and grandmother in a building with the kind of stairs that complained about carrying anything larger than a box of cereal. He made space in her schedule, wrote it into a contract, tripled her pay, and offended half his board. Cassandra called to remind him about optics and leads and whispered that good deeds had a way of making their doers look opportunistic, if not performed correctly. He said, "I'm okay with looking opportunistic. I'm less okay with being an opportunity that only ever benefits me." He visited Maris's apartment 2 weeks later, not as a benefactor, but as a man who had promised a bench and needed to see if it was level. Matthias opened the door, stared at Adrian's shoes, and said, "You have quiet shoes." "I try," Adrian said. "Don't try too hard," Matthias said, then returned to his maps. The piano fit the living room like it had been waiting for them to make room for it. The window beside it looked down on a street that grew trees with dirty leaves and small miracles. On top of the piano there was a framed photograph of a woman who had clearly taught laughter to everyone in the picture and a rosary laying like a road. "Abuela?" Maris said, touching the frame. "She told me a lie I needed until I could tell myself the truth." "What lie?" "That talent is like a stubborn plant. It'll grow through concrete if it has to." Maris smiled, and then she worked like hell to soften the concrete. "Where is she?" "Working," Maris said. "She refuses to retire because this is our country, and she refuses to be invisible in it." He understood the pride hiding under the humor. He had worn a version of it when people told him he was too young to be worth the bet he asked them to make. The conservatory evaluation said what the lobby had already shouted: genius tempered by hunger, not just promise, but proof. She began to study with a woman named Vega, who had stopped competing because the machine of it had turned music into war, and she preferred peace as a discipline. Maris worked 40 hours and trained 20. Adrian had never respected someone more. He didn't fall in love the way he'd been taught it would feel. He didn't fall at all. He discovered that love was a word for the quiet certainty that he wanted to be the kind of roof that didn't leak when her weather grew strange. He discovered that if he walked into a room where she was playing, the world's clock adjusted to something kinder. A scandal tried to attach itself to their work 3 months in. The wrong kind of paper wrote the right kind of lie, the sort that isn't entirely untrue. Billionaire CEO moves janitor from mop to Steinway. Rumors swirl. The comments were knives disguised as concern. Cassandra called because that's what people like her are paid to do. "Distance yourself," she said. "Fund the program without making it about her." "It is about her," he said, surprising himself again. "It's about her and whoever else we find behind a broom who's carrying the kind of cathedral that makes other buildings look like boxes." "Adrian," she said, with a sigh that made his name sound like a burden she was nobly lifting. "No one likes to be told they ignore geniuses. It makes their philanthropy feel sloppy. Your job is to make donors feel like they're buying perfection." "My job," he said quietly, "isn't a job anymore." He went to Maris, showed her the article, and waited for anger. She read it twice, set it aside, and said, "Is your board angry?" "Yes." "Are your investors?" He thought of the men who had told him how to widen rivers with exact margins. "No." "Are the dishwashers?" He blinked. "I don't know," she smiled. "Ask the dishwashers." So he did. He gathered everyone in the service lounge at the end of a shift, the night team with the softest voices, the morning team with the stiffest backs, the ones who kept things alive when no one was watching. He stood where managers stand to tell people the new plan, and did the opposite. "That article made me realize I've been running this place like the music lives upstairs," he said. "That's my mistake. The first time I heard our piano sing, it was because someone who cleans it asked permission to touch it. It will never be just decor again." Starting next month, the Whittemore will close the lobby to donors for one night and open it to families for free lessons, concerts, food. Anyone who works here can sign up their kid, their neighbor, themselves. If you need a piano, we'll put one in your living room. If you need time, we'll make it. There was a silence that felt like weather before a storm. Then the pastry chef started to cry without warning and said, "I played when I was 13. And a woman from laundry whispered, "My mama sang in a church that didn't have a roof, but had harmonies that put shame to a cathedral." And someone laughed the kind of laugh that grows on trees you've watered for years without fruit. And he understood that all he had done was move the piano from upstairs to where it belonged. Maris played the first of those nights. She didn't perform. She sat at the bench like a friend and said, "Who wants to go first?" A boy with sneakers that had lost the argument with the sidewalk raised his hand. She handed him the keys like they were safe to hold. It would be a cleaner story to say, "That's when the board fell in line, and Cassandra learned to love smudged fingerprints on the lobby's glass." Boards rarely fall in line. Cassandra appreciated music when it raised funds. But donors came who had never heard themselves spoken to, and families carried home instruments, and a woman who washed dishes in a building where rooms cost more than she made in a week played a prelude that made the elevator maintenance man swear softly and say, "I forgot I had a soundtrack." And somewhere in all that, Adrian lost track of prepositions. He stopped doing things for people and started doing things with them. It sounds like grammar. It felt like revolution. 6 months after that first night, he told Maris he was in love with her. It was in a kitchen because kitchens are where people tell the truth when they've learned to stop performing it. He said it while drying dishes because he'd learned that hands that are useful make words meaningful. "I was a joke when I made that offer," he said. "I don't want to be one now." "You want to keep your promise," she said, not unkindly. "I want to keep our lives," he corrected, "which is different." She looked at him for a long time in the way that had made him better at waiting. "I can't marry a dare," she said, "but I could marry the man who stopped asking music to perform and started asking it to live with him." "Marry that man," he said too quickly, then laughed at himself. "I will grow into him." "You already are." She took his hand with her calloused one, and he remembered the lemon oil on her knuckle, the way she had asked the piano permission the first time. He understood then that love wasn't possession, it was reverence practiced daily. He proposed at the Whittemore, not in the lobby where money listens for its own echo, but in the service lounge with the bad chairs. He brought flowers he had no idea how to arrange, and a ring that looked like it knew how to wait. Matthias drew a map of the hotel and drew a heart where they stood and said, "This is the quietest place in the building. Yes is supposed to sound like this." They were married on a Sunday. The chairs were mismatched because the right ones were busy being useful elsewhere. The pastry chef baked a cake that tasted like someone had forgiven you during dessert. The quartet played for free and badly on purpose during one song because the dishwasher's daughter wanted to laugh in her wedding pictures. Cassandra came because people like her always come, and she cried in a way that surprised even her, and told him quietly that she was learning to like fingerprints. After the vows, Maris sat at the piano and didn't play a performance, didn't play a piece with a name. She played their building, hallways and elevators, and the slice of the sky you could see from the fourth-floor stairwell window, the sound of a server's laugh at 2 a.m, the drip-drip of the ice machine that meant someone would have to call maintenance, the way a kid's sneakers squeaked after too much lobby running. She played the rhythm of a family that had decided to be one, and as the music went out into the room, people felt their wrists loosen and their teeth unclench, and the thing they had called fine all week finally adjust into a truer word.